It was December 2008 in Chicago. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled, and the governor of Illinois walked confidently to the podium. He smiled, brushed back his thick black hair, and prepared to make a statement. But this wasn't a routine press conference about new legislation or infrastructure. Just hours earlier, federal agents had led him away in handcuffs. The same man who had promised to fight corruption in Illinois politics was now at the center of one of the most notorious scandals in modern American history. Rod Blagojevich wasn't a nobody in politics. Born in Chicago in 1956 to a Serbian immigrant family, he worked his way up from boxing and odd jobs to a career in law and then politics. By the early 2000s, he was a rising Democratic star. In 2003, he became the 40th governor of Illinois, making history as the first Democrat in decades to hold the office. His thick mane of hair, his loud personality, and his populist style made him stand out. He cultivated the image of a reformer, a man of the people. But behind the scenes, federal investigators were already watching him closely. The scandal that would bring him down was tied to one of the biggest moments in American history. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected President of the United States, leaving his Illinois Senate seat vacant. Under Illinois law, the governor had the power to appoint Obama's replacement. That decision carried enormous political weight, and Blagojevich saw it as his ticket to fortune and influence. According to FBI wiretaps, he treated the appointment as something he could sell. He was recorded bragging that the seat was, in his words, bleeping golden, and that he wasn't going to give it away for nothing. What followed was a web of conversations that shocked the public once revealed. Investigators captured Blagojevich, exploring whether he could exchange the Senate seat for a lucrative job, a cabinet position, campaign donations, or even a high-paying role for his wife. The brazenness of it all stunned people, not because corruption was new in Illinois politics, but because he seemed so casual, almost reckless, in how he pursued it. The FBI had been building a case for years, and in December 2008, they made their move. Agents arrested Blagojevich at his Chicago home. The image of a sitting governor taken away in handcuffs dominated national headlines. By 2010, he was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, extortion, and bribery. His first trial ended with a hung jury on most counts, but prosecutors regrouped and came back stronger. In 2011, Blagojevich was convicted on 17 counts, including attempting to sell Obama's Senate seat. The trial revealed more than just backroom deals. It painted a portrait of a man addicted to power and willing to leverage any opportunity for personal gain. In December 2011, he was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, one of the harshest penalties for political corruption in modern U.S. history. The fall was dramatic. This was not just another crooked politician losing his career. This was a sitting governor, once seen as a reformer, now being shipped off to serve more than a decade behind bars. The sentence sent shockwaves across Illinois, a state with a long history of corruption, but rarely such a bold attempt at political barter caught so clearly on tape. Blagojevich reported to federal prison in 2012. For years, he kept a relatively low profile behind bars, working small jobs inside the facility, and reportedly maintaining his signature head of hair as best he could. His wife Patty became his loudest advocate, appealing publicly for leniency. And in 2020, her efforts paid off. President Donald Trump commuted Blagojevich's sentence, allowing him to walk free after serving about 8 years. Standing outside his home in Chicago, his hair now streaked with gray but his bravado intact, Blagojevich told reporters he was a Trumpocrat, grateful for his second chance. But the story didn't end there. In February 2025, Donald Trump went further than his 2020 commutation, granting Rod Blagojevich a full and unconditional presidential pardon, wiping his federal convictions from the record. Overnight, the disgraced governor was legally cleared. The move reignited fierce debate. Supporters framed it as redemption for a man they believed was unfairly targeted, while critics blasted it as a slap in the face to accountability and a dangerous signal to other politicians tempted by corruption. For the people of Illinois, the pardon didn't erase the memory of his arrest in 2008 or the recordings that exposed him treating a U.S. Senate seat like a bargaining chip. His downfall came to symbolize the deep cynicism voters already felt, that behind the speeches and promises, politics was little more than a marketplace where influence was up for sale. Imagine being an Illinois voter watching your own governor, the man elected to represent you, speak casually about trading one of the highest offices in the country for cash or favors. To many, it confirmed their worst fears about how power really works. And yet, Blagojevich's case was not an isolated one. Illinois politics has a long history of scandal, and across America, governors, senators, and mayors have been caught following the same destructive path of greed and entitlement. So if you thought a governor trying to auction off a Senate seat was audacious, wait until you hear about a beloved mayor who transformed his city into his own personal empire of kickbacks and cash. Number 2. Kwame Kilpatrick. On election night in 2001, the city of Detroit seemed alive with hope. Crowds cheered as a young man in a sharp suit, barely into his 30s, walked onto the stage. At just 31 years old, Kwame Kilpatrick was sworn in as the youngest mayor in Detroit's history. The son of a congresswoman with a gift for fiery speeches and a reputation as a rising star, he was seen as the fresh face who could rescue a city weighed down by decades of economic decline. Supporters called him the hip-hop mayor, a leader who could bridge the old and the new. What no one imagined that night was that Kilpatrick would eventually become one of the most notorious symbols of political corruption in America. Kwame Kilpatrick's rise was meteoric. Born in 1970, he grew up immersed in Detroit politics. His mother, Carolyn Cheeks Kilpatrick, served in the U.S. House of Representatives, and politics ran in the family's blood. He was charismatic, confident, and ambitious, quickly winning a seat in the Michigan House of Representatives before leaping to the mayor's office. To a struggling city, his energy looked like a lifeline, but behind the swagger and big promises, Kilpatrick was already weaving a web of deals that would unravel everything. Once in power, Kilpatrick surrounded himself with loyal friends and allies, many of whom became part of what prosecutors would later describe as a criminal enterprise. City contracts worth millions of dollars were steered toward certain companies, often in exchange for kickbacks. Developers, contractors, and business leaders soon learned that doing business with Detroit meant paying to play. It wasn't just bribery. It was an organized pattern that investigators would eventually classify under RICO, the same racketeering law used to prosecute mob bosses. The red flags began to surface early. In 2008, a text message scandal revealed that Kilpatrick and his chief of staff had engaged in an extramarital affair, contradicting sworn testimony he had given in a whistleblower lawsuit. The scandal forced him to resign and serve jail time for perjury. Many assumed that was the end of his story, but federal investigators had been quietly working behind the scenes, piecing together something far larger than a scandal about text messages. In 2010, the FBI and federal prosecutors indicted Kilpatrick, along with several associates, on charges of racketeering, bribery, extortion, and fraud. The evidence painted a picture of a mayor who had turned his city into a personal empire. Kilpatrick was accused of pressuring contractors for cash, demanding bribes, and even using city funds for luxury vacations, spa treatments, and personal spending. The scale was breathtaking. Investigators claimed he and his circle had siphoned off more than $9 million from Detroit through fraudulent schemes. The trial began in 2012 and stretched on for months. Witness after witness testified about the payoffs, the cash stuffed into envelopes, and the fear among city officials who felt they had no choice but to comply. Federal prosecutors argued that Kilpatrick had run Detroit City Hall like a criminal organization. putting his personal gain above the needs of residents who were already struggling through unemployment, crumbling infrastructure, and one of the worst financial crises in the city's history. In March 2013, the verdict came down. Kwame Kilpatrick was found guilty on 24 federal felony counts, including racketeering conspiracy, extortion, mail fraud, and wire fraud. In October of that year, he was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison, one of the harshest sentences ever handed down to a public official in modern times. The judge, Nancy Edmonds, said Kilpatrick had abused the public trust on a staggering level. The fall was devastating. This was not a minor scandal. It was the complete implosion of a man once seen as Detroit's future. For a city already reeling from bankruptcy and decline, Kilpatrick's betrayal cut deep. Residents who had believed in his promises now saw him as proof of why their city couldn't climb out of its problems. National media covered the story relentlessly, portraying him as the poster child for corruption in urban politics. Kilpatrick began serving his sentence in federal prison, but the story didn't end there. In January 2021, after serving just about 7 years, he was granted clemency by President Donald Trump, who commuted his sentence. The announcement stunned many. Supporters celebrated his release, arguing that his punishment had been excessive, while critics saw it as another example of political favoritism at the highest level. Today, Kilpatrick lives outside prison, working as a minister and public speaker, trying to rebuild his life far from the spotlight of Detroit politics. For Detroit residents, however, the damage lingered. The scandal left deep scars on the city's political landscape and further eroded trust in leadership. Imagine being a resident who had believed in his words back in 2001, only to watch the mayor's office transformed into a hub of corruption while the city's neighborhoods fell into disrepair. It was a betrayal that confirmed the worst fears about what happens when power goes unchecked. Kilpatrick's case remains a cautionary tale of how charisma and ambition can mask greed and arrogance. He began as a symbol of hope, but he ended as a symbol of excess. And while his sentence was cut short, the shadow of his downfall still looms over Detroit. Yet, as shocking as a young mayor turning his city into a racketeering enterprise might sound, corruption wasn't confined to City Hall. It reached into the very halls of Congress, where one decorated war hero turned lawmaker would be exposed for selling his office to the highest bidder. Number 3. Randy Duke Cunningham. The sound of applause once filled the air as Randall Duke Cunningham stepped onto stages across America. He wasn't just another congressman in a suit, he was a decorated Vietnam War hero, a former Navy fighter pilot whose dogfights in the skies had made him a legend. His name was etched into history books as the first U.S. flying ace of the Vietnam War, celebrated for his courage and skill. But decades later, the same man who had been hailed as a patriot would stand in federal court, weeping as he admitted he had betrayed his country, not in combat, but in Congress. Born in 1941 in Los Angeles, Cunningham's early life followed the path of discipline and service. After graduating from college, he joined the Navy, becoming a fighter pilot. During the Vietnam War, his daring missions earned him widespread respect. His story was even part of the inspiration for Hollywood films that glorified American fighter pilots. After leaving active service, Cunningham transitioned into teaching and eventually politics, running for Congress in California in 1990. For many voters, his war record made him untouchable. He was the war hero turned public servant, someone you could trust to fight for the country just as he had in the skies. But once inside Washington, power and money began to change him. Cunningham served on key committees, including the House Appropriations Committee and its Defense Subcommittee, positions that gave him influence over billions of dollars in defense contracts. It didn't take long for defense contractors and businessmen to realize that his vote and his influence could be bought. The scheme was both brazen and oddly personal. Investigators later revealed that Cunningham accepted at least $2.4 million in bribes from defense contractors in exchange for steering contracts their way. The bribes didn't always come in the form of cash. He received a yacht, luxury cars, antique furnishings, expensive rugs, and even the payment of his personal debts. One bribe was so blatant it came in the form of a bribe menu, a handwritten note in which Cunningham listed what government favors would cost, from $50,000 to several $100,000, depending on the contract size. The scandal began to unravel in 2005 when journalists started asking questions about Cunningham's lavish lifestyle. He was living in a mansion well beyond the means of a congressman's salary. Federal investigators soon uncovered the truth: a sprawling corruption scheme that turned a respected lawmaker into one of the most notorious cases of bribery in U.S. political history. On November 28, 2005, Cunningham stood in a federal courtroom in San Diego and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit bribery, mail fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Tears streamed down his face as he admitted to betraying the trust of his constituents. In March 2006, he was sentenced to 100 months in federal prison, more than 8 years. The judge called his crimes unbelievably egregious, noting how he had sold his office to the highest bidder. The fall was dramatic not just because of the money involved, but because of who he had once been. Here was a man who had risked his life for his country, transformed into a symbol of how greed can corrode even the most honored reputations. To the American public, it was a gut punch. How could a war hero, a man whose very identity was tied to honor and service, have ended up selling out his office for yachts and Persian rugs? Cunningham began serving his sentence at a federal prison in Arizona. During his incarceration, he reportedly struggled with depression and isolation, reflecting on the choices that had led him there. In 2013, after serving nearly 7 years, he was released early to a halfway house, later moving to Florida. Stripped of his status, pension, and reputation, he faded quietly from the public eye. The broader fallout was significant. Cunningham's conviction sent shockwaves through Congress, leading to new scrutiny over defense contracts and lobbying practices. For constituents back home, it was more personal. Imagine being a veteran who had voted for him, someone who looked at him as a living reminder of sacrifice, only to find out that his career ended in scandal. The sense of betrayal cut deep. Cunningham's story is a stark reminder that personal glory and public service can be eroded by the lure of wealth and privilege. He went from being celebrated for defending his country to being condemned for selling it out. His tears in the courtroom may have been genuine, but they couldn't undo the damage he had caused to public trust. And as shocking as it was to see a decorated war hero in handcuffs, he wasn't the only governor or lawmaker brought down by corruption. Just months later, another Midwestern leader, this one the governor of Illinois, would face his own reckoning for years of shady deals and broken promises. Number 4. George Ryan. On January 12, 2003, in Springfield, Illinois, a crowd gathered for what should have been a routine moment in the state's history, the swearing in of a new governor. But the cameras weren't just focused on the incoming official. They were also locked on the man leaving office, George Ryan, who just days earlier had made national headlines for emptying Illinois' death row with a single stroke of his pen. He walked away, hailed by some as a humanitarian, condemned by others as reckless. But behind the applause and controversy, another story was already closing in, one of corruption, betrayal, and a downfall that would land him in federal prison. George Ryan's life in politics had spanned decades. Born in 1934 in Kankakee, Illinois, he came from a working-class background and ran a family pharmacy before moving into politics. He climbed steadily through the ranks, first as a state legislator, then lieutenant governor, and eventually Secretary of State. By 1999, he had reached the top, sworn in as Illinois' 39th governor. Ryan projected the image of an old-school public servant, pragmatic, plain-spoken, and deeply rooted in his hometown values. But behind that image was a system riddled with corruption, much of it tied to his years in the Secretary of State's office. The scheme that would bring Ryan down was both sprawling and tragic. During his tenure as Secretary of State, driver's licenses were allegedly issued in exchange for bribes, often to unqualified truck drivers. One of those drivers, who had obtained a license through this pay-to-play system, caused a horrific accident in 1994 that killed 6 children in a single family. The tragedy brought national attention and ignited scrutiny into how Ryan's office was operating. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a network of fraud, payoffs, and political favors stretching back years. Federal prosecutors charged Ryan with racketeering, fraud, and obstruction of justice, alleging that he had steered contracts to political allies, accepted gifts and vacations, and used state resources for personal benefit. The evidence included free trips, luxury perks, and campaign contributions that blurred the line between public service and personal enrichment. For a man who had presented himself as a steady hand in government, the revelations were damning. The trial began in 2005 and stretched into the following year. It captivated Illinois residents, already weary from decades of political scandal. Witness after witness described a culture of favoritism and pay-to-play politics. Prosecutors argued that Ryan had not only betrayed the public trust, but also contributed to an environment where safety and fairness were sacrificed for profit. His defense tried to paint him as a dedicated leader, but the evidence told a different story. In April 2006, George Ryan was convicted on 18 counts, including racketeering, fraud, and lying to federal agents. At age 72, he was sentenced to 6.5 years in federal prison. He began serving his time in 2007, first at a facility in Wisconsin and later in Indiana. For more than 5 years, the once powerful governor lived behind bars, another name added to Illinois' long and infamous list of leaders brought down by corruption. The irony of Ryan's career was stark. Just before leaving office, he had taken one of the boldest steps in U.S. history by granting clemency to every prisoner on Illinois' death row, citing deep flaws in the justice system. That act made him a hero to some activists and a villain to victims' families. Yet only a few years later, he was himself an inmate, stripped of his title and reputation. The contradiction between those two legacies, one of mercy, the other of corruption, defined how history would remember him. Ryan was released from prison in 2013 after serving more than 5 years. He lived quietly in his later years, largely out of the public spotlight, though his conviction remained a bitter chapter for Illinois politics. In 2025, George Ryan died at the age of 90. His passing reignited debate over how he should be remembered, as the man who courageously emptied death row, or as the governor who betrayed his office through corruption. For many, the answer was both. Imagine being an Illinois voter in the late 1990s, casting your ballot for Ryan because you believed he was the steady hand the state needed, only to watch his name dragged through a years-long corruption trial. The sense of betrayal wasn't abstract, it was personal, felt in every taxpayer dollar misused, and every corner of government tainted by favoritism. George Ryan's story shows the complicated truth of American politics, that the same person can make a historic moral stand and yet be deeply compromised by corruption. He left behind a legacy both admired and condemned, a split image that still sparks arguments years later. And yet, Illinois was not alone in producing such scandals. While Ryan's downfall unfolded in the Midwest, down south in Louisiana, another longtime governor would face his own reckoning. This time, not for driver's licenses, but for a scheme of bribes and payoffs tied to the gambling industry. Number 5. Edwin Edwards. In Louisiana politics, few names carried as much weight or as much controversy as Edwin Edwards. For decades, he was the state's most charismatic figure, a man whose sharp wit and Cajun charm made him both beloved and infamous. To his supporters, Edwards was a populist who spoke their language, a leader who could light up a room with a joke and deliver votes with the same ease. To his critics, he was the embodiment of Louisiana's reputation for corruption. And in 2000, when a jury found him guilty of racketeering, extortion, and fraud, those critics finally saw him fall. Edwin Washington Edwards was born in 1927 in rural Louisiana. He rose from modest beginnings to become a lawyer, then a state senator, and eventually the governor of Louisiana. His political career spanned more than 3 decades, making him one of the most enduring figures in the state's history. Edwards served an unprecedented 4 terms as governor, winning elections in 1972, 1975, 1983, and 1991. He styled himself as a defender of the common man, someone who understood the struggles of ordinary Louisianans. His charisma was undeniable, and even his opponents often admitted he could out-campaign anyone. But along with his rise came whispers, then outright accusations, of corruption. Edwards was no stranger to federal investigations. As early as the 1970s, he faced scrutiny for questionable dealings, though he often escaped conviction. He seemed untouchable, surviving scandals that would have destroyed most political careers. His ability to spin humor out of his troubles only strengthened his image. He famously once quipped that the only way he'd lose an election in Louisiana was if he were caught in bed with a dead girl or a live boy. Lines like that made him a legend, but they also reflected the arrogance that came with years of dodging accountability. By the 1990s, federal investigators had zeroed in on Edwards once again, this time over a scheme involving riverboat casino licenses. Louisiana had recently legalized gambling, and casino licenses were a lucrative prize. Prosecutors alleged that Edwards and his associates used the licensing process as a cash machine, extorting money and favors from companies in exchange for political approval. Millions of dollars were at stake, and investigators argued that Edwards treated the process as an opportunity to enrich himself and his allies. The trial began in January 2000 and quickly became one of the most high-profile corruption cases in the nation. The charges included racketeering, extortion, mail fraud, and wire fraud. Witnesses testified about payoffs, hidden deals, and the inner workings of Edwards' political machine. The prosecution argued that the governor had used his office as a criminal enterprise, leveraging his influence over gambling to line his own pockets. The defense countered by portraying Edwards as a victim of overzealous prosecutors, a man targeted because of his long history and colorful reputation. But the evidence was overwhelming. In May 2000, Edwards was found guilty on 17 counts. The verdict sent shockwaves through Louisiana. For decades, Edwards had seemed immune to the scandal swirling around him, a larger-than-life figure who always slipped away unscathed. Now, at the age of 72, he faced the reality of prison. In 2001, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The image of the longtime governor, once the most powerful man in Louisiana, now reduced to an inmate, marked the end of an era. For many Louisianans, his downfall was bittersweet. Some mourned the loss of a political giant who had brought flair and excitement to their state. Others felt vindicated, believing justice had finally caught up with him. Edwards served 8 years before being released in 2011. Remarkably, he remained a public figure even after prison. He appeared in documentaries, gave interviews, and even starred in a reality television show about his life. In 2014, at the age of 86, he attempted a political comeback, running for Congress. He lost, but the very fact that he could mount a campaign showed just how deeply his name was woven into Louisiana politics. For historians, Edwards remains a paradox. He was both a populist champion and a convicted racketeer. His legacy is divided between those who remember him for programs that help the poor and those who see him as the ultimate symbol of corruption in Louisiana's history. Imagine being a voter who laughed along with his jokes at a campaign rally in the 1980s, only to later watch him stand before a judge, stripped of the very power that had once seemed untouchable. Edwards' story reflects a broader truth about American politics, that charisma and charm can carry a leader a long way, but eventually the weight of corruption catches up. For all his one-liners and his flair, Edwin Edwards will forever be remembered as a governor who crossed the line between politics and crime. And yet, Louisiana wasn't the only state where governors faced such reckonings. While Edwards' fall came through the lure of casino money, in Connecticut, another governor would be forced from office, this time brought down by contractors, bribes, and a corruption probe that ended his career in disgrace. Number 6. John G. Rowland. In the late 1990s, Connecticut seemed to have a golden boy. At just 37 years old, Rowland had become the state's youngest governor, a polished Republican with national ambitions. He was handsome, articulate, and popular enough that some whispered he might even have a shot at higher office. To many, he embodied the promise of a new generation of leadership. But behind the smooth image was a pattern of questionable dealings that would eventually force him not only from office, but also into prison, twice. Rowland's rise had been swift. Born in 1957 in Waterbury, Connecticut, he entered politics young, winning a seat in Congress in the 1980s before turning his sights on the governor's mansion. Elected in 1994, he quickly became a household name in the state. He cut the ribbon at schools, celebrated economic projects, and positioned himself as a conservative leader with a pragmatic streak. For a while, it worked. Connecticut voters re-elected him easily, and his career seemed unstoppable. But power often brings temptation. As investigators would later show, Rowland developed a taste for perks that went far beyond his governor's salary. Renovations on his lakeside vacation home were secretly paid for by contractors doing business with the state. He accepted expensive gifts, free work, vacations, even a hot tub, from people who expected something in return. On the surface, he remained the polished, smiling governor. Behind the scenes, he was crossing ethical lines that would eventually end his career. By the early 2000s, the FBI had begun looking closely at Rowland's finances and the flow of favors around his office. In 2004, the pressure became unbearable. Facing a federal corruption probe, Rowland resigned as governor in July of that year. It was a stunning moment for Connecticut. A leader once considered a rising star was now leaving in disgrace. Later that year, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit honest services fraud and tax evasion. In 2005, he was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison. For many, it seemed like the end of the story. He had fallen, served his time, and might quietly rebuild his life. But Rowland wasn't finished with politics, or with scandal. After his release, he reinvented himself as a radio talk show host, his voice filling Connecticut airwaves as he offered commentary on the very world that had rejected him. Behind the microphone, he rebuilt his image, speaking directly to listeners and positioning himself as a man who had paid his dues. Yet behind the scenes, old habits lingered. In 2014, Rowland once again found himself in federal court, this time charged with violating campaign finance laws. Prosecutors accused him of secretly working as a paid consultant for 2 Republican congressional campaigns while disguising his role. Instead of being officially listed, his payments were routed through sham contracts, hiding the fact that he was on the payroll. Investigators argued that Rowland had tried to use back channels to maintain influence while avoiding disclosure rules. The evidence was damning. Emails, contracts, and testimony painted a clear picture of deception. In September 2014, Rowland was convicted on multiple counts, including falsifying records, causing false statements, and conspiracy. In 2015, he was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison, his second conviction in just over a decade. For Connecticut residents, the sense of déjà vu was striking. The man who had once been the state's youngest and most promising governor was now a 2-time felon. His story wasn't just about personal greed, it was about how easily power can corrupt, and how even a second chance can be squandered. Rowland began serving his second prison term in 2016. By then, his political career was long over. When he was released in 2018, he kept a lower profile, far from the spotlight that had once followed him. The fall was complete, from governor with national potential to twice convicted felon whose name became synonymous with scandal in Connecticut. The broader impact was heavy. Rowland's downfall deepened cynicism in a state already wary of political corruption. Imagine being a voter who had supported him in the 1990s, believing in the promise of fresh leadership, only to watch him resign in disgrace not once, but twice. The betrayal wasn't just political. It was personal for many who had believed in his polished image. Rowland's story is a warning about how power and arrogance can lead to repeated mistakes. The first conviction might have been seen as a tragedy, a promising career cut short by greed. But the second made it clear, this was no accident, but a pattern. His legacy will always be defined not by the hope he once inspired, but by the scandals that destroyed his career. And while Connecticut watched its governor fall twice, another American city was grappling with its own scandal. In New Orleans, a mayor who once stood before television cameras as a leader during disaster would later face his own reckoning. Convicted of turning tragedy into an opportunity for personal gain. Number 7. Clarence Ray Nagin Jr. In August 2005, as Hurricane Katrina ripped through New Orleans, one man's face became inseparable from the crisis. Mayor Ray Nagin stood before television cameras, voice trembling with urgency, pleading for help as floodwaters swallowed his city. His emotional speeches, especially the infamous Chocolate City remark, turned him into both a symbol of leadership under fire and a lightning rod for criticism. For many Americans, Nagin was the man on the ground during one of the country's worst disasters, but less than a decade later, his name would return to the headlines, this time not for a storm, but for corruption that would send him to federal prison. Clarence Ray Nagin Jr. was born in 1956 in New Orleans and grew up in modest circumstances. He worked in the private sector for years, first as a cable television executive, before jumping into politics. In 2002, he won the mayoral race as a reform candidate, promising to clean up City Hall and modernize a city long plagued by corruption. With his businessman's background and outsider status, he seemed like a fresh alternative to the entrenched political machines of Louisiana. In the early days, many residents saw him as a straight-talking leader who could finally break the cycle of backroom deals. But promises of reform quickly collided with reality. Hurricane Katrina brought national attention to Nagin's leadership, but it also exposed deep cracks in New Orleans governance. While he was front and center during the disaster, his administration quietly fostered relationships that federal investigators would later prove were steeped in corruption. Construction companies, contractors, and businessmen seeking post-Katrina recovery contracts discovered that influence at City Hall came at a price. According to federal prosecutors, Nagin accepted more than $500,000 in bribes, along with free trips, private jet rides, and granite for his family's countertop business, all in exchange for steering millions of dollars in city contracts. The scheme stretched across multiple years, even as the city was struggling to rebuild. While residents were fighting to restore their homes and lives, the mayor was making secret deals to benefit himself. The investigation gained momentum in the early 2010s, with the FBI tracing the flow of money and favors connected to Nagin's office. Witnesses, including businessmen once close to him, flipped and testified against him. The evidence was damning: bank records, invoices, and testimony that painted a picture of a mayor who had turned recovery into opportunity. In January 2013, a federal grand jury indicted Nagin on 21 counts, including bribery, honest services, wire fraud, money laundering, and tax violations. The trial began in 2014 and captivated both New Orleans and the nation. prosecutors argued that Nagin had sold his office, taking bribes while citizens faced devastation. His defense painted him as overwhelmed during Katrina and unfairly targeted afterward. But the jury wasn't convinced. In February 2014, Nagin was convicted on 20 of 21 counts. The verdict marked a stunning downfall. The same man who had once stood before the nation as the face of a city in crisis was now a convicted felon. In July of that year, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The sentence carried symbolic weight. For decades, New Orleans had battled a reputation for political corruption, and Nagin's conviction showed that even the most visible figures weren't untouchable. Residents who had once rallied behind him in the chaos of Katrina now felt betrayed. Imagine being a survivor who had watched his speeches in 2005, clinging to his words for reassurance, only to later learn that behind the scenes he was cutting deals for granite and cash. The contrast was devastating. Nagin began serving his sentence at a federal prison in Texas. For years, he remained largely out of the spotlight, occasionally filing appeals, but with little success. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, he was released early under compassionate release provisions after serving roughly 6 years. Since then, he has lived quietly, far removed from the power and notoriety he once commanded. The broader fallout left scars on New Orleans politics. The city, still healing from Katrina and its aftermath, had to reckon with the knowledge that its leader during those critical years had exploited his office. For many, Nagin's case confirmed their deepest fears, that corruption had seeped into even the most desperate moments of public service. Ray Nagin's story is one of tragic irony. He entered politics promising reform, became a national figure in America's darkest natural disaster, and ended up defined not by his leadership, but by his betrayal. His conviction closed the chapter on one of New Orleans' most polarizing leaders, leaving behind a complicated legacy of both crisis management and corruption. And while New Orleans wrestled with its mayor's fall from grace, another American city up north was dealing with its own scandal, this time involving a charismatic mayor whose charm couldn't save him when federal investigators uncovered a culture of bribery and backroom deals that reached deep into City Hall. Number 8. Buddy Cianci. In Providence, Rhode Island, there was once a mayor so famous, so colorful, that his name alone became shorthand for the city itself. Vincent Buddy Cianci wasn't just a politician, he was a local celebrity, a man whose face appeared on billboards, radio shows, and even his own line of pasta sauce. To many residents, he was Providence. But beneath the charm and charisma was a darker story, one that ended with federal agents storming City Hall in a sting called Operation Plunderdome, and a mayor's career collapsing under the weight of corruption. Buddy Cianci's journey into politics was anything but ordinary. Born in 1941, he grew up in Providence and earned a law degree before turning to public service. In 1974, he was elected mayor, becoming the first of Italian heritage to hold the office. He quickly made a name for himself as a dynamic, tough-talking leader. Under Cianci, Providence experienced a wave of revitalization, new development, arts investments, and a renewed sense of civic pride. For a city long dismissed as gritty and fading, he seemed like the perfect leader to put it back on the map. But Cianci's first stint in office ended in scandal. In 1984, he was forced to resign after being convicted of assault for attacking a man he believed was having an affair with his wife. Many assumed his career was over, yet remarkably, Cianci reinvented himself. By 1991, he was back, re-elected as mayor in a stunning political comeback. For another decade, he held court in Providence, hosting radio shows, charming voters with his wit, and presiding over a city that on the surface seemed to be thriving. Behind the scenes, however, federal investigators were quietly watching. Rumors had long swirled that Providence under Cianci was fueled not just by civic pride, but by backroom deals and a system of favors that blurred the line between governance and graft. In 1999, the FBI launched a sweeping probe, wiretapping officials and tracking money trails. They called it Operation Plunder Dome. What they found was a culture of corruption that reached deep into City Hall. According to prosecutors, contractors seeking city work were expected to pay kickbacks. Jobs, licenses, and contracts often came with a price tag. While Cianci was not accused of personally pocketing every bribe, the evidence showed that he presided over an administration steeped in corruption, and that he had used his position to maintain power and influence through these illicit networks. The revelations were devastating. The very mayor who had become a symbol of Providence's comeback was now the face of its darkest secrets. In 2001, federal agents raided City Hall, seizing files and arresting multiple officials. The headlines shocked Rhode Island, though many residents admitted they had long suspected something wasn't right. Cianci himself was indicted on charges of racketeering conspiracy. The trial that followed drew enormous attention, not just in Providence, but across the country, because Cianci wasn't just another mayor, he was a political brand. In 2002, Cianci was convicted of racketeering conspiracy. Though he was acquitted on more serious bribery counts, the jury concluded that he had overseen a city hall where corruption wasn't just tolerated, but expected. That summer, he was forced to resign once again, ending his second run as mayor in disgrace. Later that year, he was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He served just over 4. For Providence residents, Cianci's downfall was bittersweet. On one hand, he had undeniably played a role in revitalizing parts of the city, bringing investment and attention it hadn't seen in years. On the other hand, his charm and civic pride were undermined by a culture of corruption that eroded public trust. Imagine being a resident who voted for him twice, celebrating the city's new energy, only to watch federal agents cart off evidence from City Hall. It was a betrayal that hit hard. Cianci was released from prison in 2007, and in true Buddy fashion, he didn't fade quietly into obscurity. He returned to radio, wrote books, and even ran for mayor again in 2014 at the age of 73. Though he lost, his campaign drew national media attention, with reporters marveling at his resilience. To his supporters, he remained the embodiment of Providence's spirit, flawed but larger than life. To his critics, he was a reminder that corruption, no matter how charming the package, still corrodes democracy. Buddy Cianci died in 2016 at the age of 74. Even in death, his legacy was hotly debated. Was he the man who saved Providence, or the man who stained its reputation? For most, the answer lay somewhere in between. He was proof that a politician can be both beloved and corrupt, a contradiction that leaves a city wrestling with how to remember him. Cianci's story showed that charisma could carry a leader a long way, but eventually the truth comes out. And he wasn't the only one. In Washington, D.C., a U.S. senator would soon face his own fall from grace, caught up in a sting operation that revealed just how far elected officials would go when they thought no one was watching. Number 9. Harrison Williams, Jr. In the late 1970s, Washington, D.C. was no stranger to whispers of corruption. Lobbyists wined and dined lawmakers, deals were made in smoke-filled rooms, and the public often wondered how much of government was truly for sale. But in 1978, the FBI launched an undercover operation that would shock the country. It was called Abscam, a sting so bold it involved undercover agents posing as wealthy Arab businessmen offering bribes to members of Congress. And at the center of the scandal was Harrison A. Williams, Jr., a U.S. senator from New Jersey whose career would end not with a speech on the Senate floor, but with a conviction in federal court. Williams had built his reputation over decades. Born in 1919, he served in World War II as a naval aviator before studying law. By the 1950s, he had entered politics, winning a seat in the U.S. Senate in 1958. Over the years, he gained a reputation as a hard-working, policy-driven lawmaker. He focused on labor rights, consumer protection, and housing. For a time, he was seen as a respected figure with significant influence. His longevity in office made him one of the most senior Democrats in the Senate. But beneath the respectable image, Williams would become ensnared in one of the most sensational stings in FBI history. Abscam began as a relatively small operation targeting stolen art and securities, but it quickly expanded when agents realized how many public officials were willing to take money in exchange for political favors. The FBI created a fake company backed by supposed Arab sheikhs looking to invest in the United States. Undercover agents, posing as representatives of these investors, approached politicians with offers of cash in return for influence. The meetings were secretly videotaped, creating undeniable evidence. For Senator Williams, the lure came in the form of promises of financial backing for a business venture involving titanium mining in Virginia. In exchange for using his influence to help secure government contracts, he allegedly agreed to accept bribes from the undercover agents. Video recordings showed him discussing the deal, a sight that stunned the American public when it was later revealed. When the FBI announced the results of Abscam in 1980, the scandal dominated headlines. 7 members of Congress were indicted, along with local officials and others. The idea that sitting lawmakers had been caught on tape accepting bribes shook faith in government at a time when trust was already fragile. For Williams, the evidence was particularly damaging. Prosecutors argued that he had abused his office by putting his personal financial interests ahead of the public good. In 1981, after a high-profile trial, Williams was convicted of bribery and conspiracy. The once-respected senator now faced the humiliation of being labeled corrupt. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, though he ultimately served about 2. In 1982, facing mounting pressure and the reality that his career was over, he resigned from the Senate. It was the first time in U.S. history that an incumbent senator had been convicted of bribery while still in office. For New Jersey voters who had supported him for more than 2 decades, the betrayal was painful. Imagine seeing your senator, a man you thought was fighting for workers' rights, sitting in a courtroom as prosecutors played videotapes of him negotiating bribes. The contrast between the public servant and the accused felon was almost surreal. The broader fallout of Abscam was enormous. The scandal revealed just how vulnerable the political system was to corruption. While some critics questioned the FBI's methods, arguing that the sting had entrapped officials, most Americans saw the videotapes as clear proof of greed in government. Trust in Congress, already shaken by Watergate a few years earlier, dropped even further. Williams became one of the most notorious examples of political downfall in the late 20th century. After serving his sentence, Williams largely disappeared from public life. He lived quietly until his death in 2001 at the age of 81. Unlike some politicians who managed to stage comebacks after scandal, Williams never regained influence. His name remains tied permanently to Abscam, a case that still stands as one of the most dramatic examples of federal investigators exposing corruption in the halls of Congress. Harrison A. Williams' story serves as a reminder that no matter how long a career or how respectable a reputation, all it takes is one lapse in judgment, one moment of greed for everything to unravel. His downfall, caught on hidden cameras, symbolized the dangers of unchecked power and personal ambition. And while Abscam shocked America in the 1980s, corruption in Congress didn't end there. Decades later, another senator from New Jersey would face his own scandal, this one involving cash, gold bars, and allegations that he had acted as a foreign agent while sitting in the United States Senate. Number 10. Robert Menendez. On July 16, 2024, a courtroom in New York fell silent as the jury returned its verdict. Sitting at the defense table was Robert Menendez, a U.S. senator from New Jersey who had spent more than 3 decades in politics. Once one of the most powerful figures in Washington, Menendez had chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and built a reputation as a seasoned lawmaker on global issues. But on that day, all of it came crashing down. The jury found him guilty of bribery, corruption, and even acting as a foreign agent. Less than a year later, on January 29, 2025, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, one of the harshest punishments ever handed down to a sitting U.S. senator. Menendez's path to power had begun humbly. Born in 1954 to Cuban immigrant parents in Union City, New Jersey, he grew up in a working-class neighborhood and often spoke of his rise as the American dream. He served as mayor of Union City, then worked his way through the state legislature before winning a seat in Congress in 1992. By 2006, he was appointed to the U.S. Senate. Known as pragmatic and influential, he built strong ties with immigrant communities, labor groups, and foreign policy circles. For years, he was considered a reliable Democratic leader in one of the country's most diverse states, but questions about his ethics had long followed him. In 2015, Menendez was indicted in a separate corruption case involving a Florida eye doctor accused of showering him with gifts and campaign contributions. That trial ended in a mistrial in 2017, and for a time, it looked as if he had dodged a career-ending bullet. Supporters celebrated, and he won re-election in 2018. But prosecutors hadn't given up, and by 2023, Menendez's name was once again tied to allegations that would prove even more damaging than before. According to federal prosecutors, Menendez and his wife accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, gold bars, luxury items, and other favors in exchange for using his political influence to benefit local businessmen and, most explosively, the Egyptian government. Investigators allege that Menendez provided sensitive information and intervened in policy matters that favored Egypt, while pocketing bribes disguised as gifts and payments. In one of the most startling details, FBI agents found gold bars and envelopes stuffed with cash during a search of his home, images that quickly circulated in the press and shocked the public. The trial in 2024 was relentless. Prosecutors laid out evidence of Menendez's close ties to wealthy associates who allegedly funneled money and goods in exchange for favors. They argued that his actions crossed the line from corruption into something darker, acting as an unregistered foreign agent while serving as a U.S. senator. For the jury, the combination of gold, cash, and influence was impossible to ignore. After weeks of testimony, they convicted him on all major counts. The sentencing in January 2025 closed a chapter not only on Menendez's career, but also on the public's faith in the system. Standing before the judge, Menendez maintained his innocence, insisting he had been unfairly targeted. But the court was unsparing. 11 years in federal prison ensured that his long tenure in politics ended not with a retirement speech, but with a prison number. For the people of New Jersey, the case was both shocking and familiar. Menendez had represented the state for decades, a fixture of its political landscape. Many voters had cast ballots for him, believing he fought for their communities in Washington, to later learn that their senator had accepted gold bars and cash while allegedly aiding a foreign government felt like the ultimate betrayal. Imagine being a New Jersey resident watching the nightly news and seeing your senator's name splashed across the screen, not for passing legislation, but for standing trial as a criminal defendant. The broader impact was immediate. Menendez's conviction sent shockwaves through Congress and reignited debates over ethics, oversight, and the vulnerability of elected officials to corruption. It also stood as a stark warning that even the highest offices in the land are not immune from greed. While critics argued the case showed deep flaws in how influence is monitored, others saw it as proof that accountability can still reach the most powerful. Menendez now sits in federal custody, a dramatic fall from the marble halls of the Senate to the confines of a prison cell. His once formidable influence in foreign policy is gone, replaced by a legacy tarnished beyond repair. He joins a long line of politicians who thought they were untouchable, only to discover that the law eventually caught up. And with his case, the arc of this documentary comes full circle. From governors and mayors to senators and congressmen, these stories show how corruption thrives wherever power and opportunity collide. Each downfall is different, yet the pattern is the same: